ahead and kick us off. Joe will likely join us in a bit. He was just coming from another session. And so please continue to say hello. We got some good representation. Hey, I'm in Milwaukee. So we got some good spread of folks and delighted to hear it. You are in Developing Implementation Plans, Meaningful Assessment, Connecting Theory to Practice. And this is a session. I'm Natasha Jankowski. Actually, I'll just jump ahead so you can be like, who is this lady talking to me? If you don't know me, I'm Natasha. Happy to be here with you today. A couple of caveats so you know what you're getting into if you haven't been in an online situation with me before. I am a fast talker. I don't know how many of you remember the Micro Machines commercials. I'm not that fast where he's just like, but I do get very excited about this topic and I speed up and I get pretty fast in my conversations on it. So apologies in advance. If I mention something as a resource, it is linked in the slides, which you will have. And there are some slides where there's extra things written so that it ensures that you're capturing the point trying to get across. But I do apologize in advance. If you need me to slow down at all, please do tell me, and I'm happy to go back over a point or engage in it. I also think that assessment is a bit more fun and better presented when it comes with humor. And so I try to do that in how I talk about and present this work. However, I will say my humor is a bit dad joke-ish in the kind of when does it become dad joke when it becomes apparent. So and some things I think I just put in to have myself laugh and crack up about. So apologies in advance for that as well. But there are two things that will be pulled in addition to the fast talking and the humor is research on what is happening in the field of assessment and what are we seeing in different places. And some of that comes from my time directing the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, or NALOA. If you're not familiar with that, great resource that is available to you there, and highly recommend it on things, but also ongoing research to look at how are things structured and what is this? And you're like, why are you continuing to do research? Because you love it? Clearly, yes. But also because Joe and I are putting together a textbook on assessment that we're submitting to publishers in the next couple of months for them to do all of their awesome copy editing and formatting things with. And so as we get more information about that, I'll totally send it out to you. But I prefer to think about assessment at the intersection of research. What are people doing? The philosophy, why are we doing this? What are we even talking about? And the equity of processes of how are we ensuring that what we're doing this is in equitable ways for ourselves and our own work, and also for our students and what we're trying to accomplish in that space. And I always have a centering of students and how do we talk about our work in that as well. So those are two things that are, well, I guess that's a variety of things that are important to know about what you are getting yourself into. So happy to have you here with us today. And Joe will tell you a bit about him.
Right on time here. Hi, everybody. My name is Joe Levy. I'm the Associate Vice Provost of Accreditation and Quality Improvement at Excelsior University. But a bit about me, I am a bit eclectic in terms of my interests and background. I was math and English as an undergrad, but then I bumped the math down when I set my sights on knowing I was going to get my master's in student affairs. No offense, math. Just wanted to focus on getting more involved and more experiential opportunities. I got my master's in student affairs in higher education, so I came up on the student affairs, co-curricular student services side. So like Natasha, serving students, supporting their development holistically is a core value and guiding principle of mine. But one of the things I found out in graduate school was there was this thing called assessment that I was seemingly the only person that understood it, and nobody wanted to do it. So as a grad student, when I was like, I want to get more experience in this, people were happy to give me that work. And I loved it and went straight from there to then working for an educational technology company to do assessment work and consult with institutions. And so I always joke that I have, over 100 years of experience because I was an extension of so many schools' staffs for multiple years. And then I got to work at a number of institutions doing assessment and accreditation work. Along the way, I became a board member and supporting Student Affairs Assessment Leaders organization because while student affairs in general is typically underfunded and less staffed, than compared to academic affairs. They certainly have typically less assessment resources. And so that organization is all about trying to provide resources and support for student affairs assessment. And along the way, similar to Natasha, given her connection with Niloa, I got to be a coach for them and go around and help different institutions implement assessment activities and do workshops, and I'm an endorsed speaker for them. And then in my free time, as you can see some pictures there, I do some amateur competitive eating, and I play bass guitar, and I do dance choreography and all sorts of other things that, just shows that assessment people contain multitudes. I'll turn it back to Natasha.
I did not know about the dance choreography part. This is news to me. But I do have to tell you, if you guys did not know this, there's also an assessment who, oh my gosh, I gotta go grab it. Her, I'll find it later when Joe's talking, and I'll flash it up. Just put out a children's book on like tracking animals. Point is, assessment people are creative in all kinds of awesome ways, and we are more than just like do your stuff. We have things that need to happen. So it's good for us as a community to also get to know all about us and the nuanced. And I want some dance choreography now. This needs to be a thing.
Got
Um,
videos.
I'm excited. We should choreograph a dance for like when the book comes out. We'll be like, yeah, I don't even know. You actually don't. You'll so I can do the like sprinkler. I can I can do that part. Beyond that, you guys are on your own. All right. So, what are you all here for with us in your time today, besides building some community? We're going to break this into two chunks that have two parts. So, symmetry. I will talk first about kind of placing this work in contextualized history of assessment, as well as a theory behind assessment structure and organization. These will be condensed versions and quick. But one of the things that Joe and I really wanted to do in thinking about the structure of a textbook was provide the history, the philosophy, some of the definitions, the threads of this work. Often we kind of start from the 1980s and are just like, get it done, accountability improvement, and we move on and forget that when we're trying to do this work, it's embedded in the things that have come before us to get us to where we need to go. So I'll set up for that. And then we'll have some time, break, answer questions, engage in conversations, that kind of thing. Joe will then talk about, what do I do? Great, thanks, Natasha. Now maybe I'm having an existential crisis, and I got all these questions about how we ended up here in our practice, and like, can we break out of this cycle? And what am I going to do? Joe will help you deal with that and think about it. And share some examples and resources as well. And then he has an opportunity to stop and engage. However, throughout that, please feel free to use chat, ask us questions, do all of that. We're excited to talk to you. But hearing no questions at the moment, I will jump in. So contextualized history of assessment. You're like, ooh, these are interesting words. What could you possibly mean by that, Natasha? I'm so glad you asked. I'd love to tell you. So one of the things that I think is so important to remember in any assessment processes that we're doing is that all of our assessment work happens within a specific place, point, and time. Our work is very place-based and embedded in where we are as an institution, what has come before us, where we're trying to go, the environment in which we're surrounded, and all of that impacts sort of our approaches, what's going on, and where we want to engage. We have all these conversations as assessment people regularly of like, I need to change this, or I'm trying to get people to do that. We are constantly in the business of change management. It feels like we're trying to get people to do things that they otherwise wouldn't. So to get them to do it, to alter any of these things, we need to make sure that we're looking at what happened before and how is what we're asking you to do different within wherever we're trying to implement it. If this is difference to a gen ed implementation, if we're trying to do something different across our institution, if we're doing something different within our student affairs, each of those contextual places will hear, interpret, understand, and be impacted by it differently because they each have different histories of what has happened to them in those spaces and why related to assessment. Most of the issues that come up when we try to implement, like, do this, I made it better and easier for you. And people are like, I don't like it. No. And why? Comes because they don't understand the context in which we're asking them to change. They don't understand what this means into relation to what we've done and why we've tried that and all of this. And now you're like, how does this have to do with history? And what are we even talking about? Great question. It matters because all of these different parts and the reason that assessment is contextual and place-based in the area in which it happens leads to tons of confusions within our institutions when we try to have a collective conversation about assessment, where we're trying to be like, hey, I'm an assessment. People are like, I don't even know what that means because assessment means very different things in very different settings. It means something different in a community college than it does at a four-year, particularly depending on the time period you're talking about it. There's also differences in why are we doing this? Like what's driving us to engage in this work? Student affairs was like, let's get into it because we find it important. And then in academic affairs, they were like, you must prove your value. Like there's different purposes and drivers to that that also lead to how the work is structured, designed, and then how we go about implementing it based in two on where we are in our theories now on how and where learning happens. So if we think it only happens in a classroom, we're trying to capture assessment in a particular way for learning there, versus if we're like, it happens in lots of places and how do we capture it? These things all impact and all have confusions as we're trying to have any kind of conversation collectively about our assessment work. So for an example, you can be like, well, no, I think I know what assessment is. And you're like, yeah, but we use one word to talk about a ton of things, like the actual assessment. I'm giving you this test, take this assessment. I want you to do this. It can be business processes depending on their backgrounds, like we're doing a needs assessment and a SWOT analysis, and we want to see where that is. It can be the act of documenting it's a process. So assessing is talking about a process, which could be an improvement process or a reporting process. And those are just a sampling to indicate like, you can't assume when you say it, people know what you're talking about. And today, sort of where we are in national conversations on assessment, most often what we mean is the systematic collection, review, and use of information about our educational programs, about courses, about experiences that students are having that we're doing because we want to improve student learning and development. We want these things to be the best that they can be, and we want our students to be amazing and coming from them in that way. But that's not always the case. And so understanding that when we talk about assessment, it comes from a particular place and time is really, really important. It's also important to think about the purposes and like, where are you and what do you want to go and what's the background that you need to go? I'm not talking about this, I'm talking about that. And we did that, and here's what happened, and here's why we're changing. So people can have that kind of thread through. Is there's different ones that are like, I just need proof of learning. I need to see that you, as a student, did it, and I want to prove that you learned it. There's also questions about like, is higher ed worth it? And what's the value? And if people are paying money, how do we know you're getting it out of there? There could be we have questions about our own efficiencies and practices. I want to see things so I can improve. We want to understand too about our design. We could have compliance measurement. The point is there's tons of different purposes. So think about in your context and what you're trying to do, what's your history? What's your purposes? What are the things that you will bump into in different spaces, whether it's student affairs, whether it's academic affairs or otherwise, as you're trying to do this assessment work? Because if you think broadly about assessment as a field, so like the work that anyone does as an assessment professional, there is a long-standing history of testing, of placing students, of just getting into military testing and kind of cool stuff on that if you're into looking at like the history of psychometricians over time. Anyway, but there's also this student development and learning background that comes from student affairs. Also, though, from student affairs and assessment, a justifying yourself in relation to academic affairs. Like we are just as good, we're also doing learning and these kinds of things. So there is some of that accountability proof point happening. There was the continuous quality improvement, CQI, TQI, CQM, all of those things that came from business that popped in and assessment was utilized about like, how are we going to be more efficient and our students consumers? And there are faculty that remember it. So when they hear improvement, they're like, wait a minute. Are you talking about certain periods where we had some interesting forums and people were widgets? There's also student success and equity, I think, is more of where we were in the last 5 years. And then sort of we can talk about where we are now. Happy to do that towards the end. But there's points in time where things happened. Like, for instance, external accountability moved from state requirements to the federal government in a note that was given by William Bennett about like maybe accreditors should look at student learning outcomes assessment in like a statement. It's ridiculous. So let's hone in on just that thread since that's such a piece of things that people talk about in history of assessment. In the 80s, which is kind of the start of like when people talk about assessment of today, States required reporting on a variety of things. They wanted to see, to be able to measure institutions across and like have a way to talk about it. Then Bennett was like, let's get accreditors to examine student learning outcomes, where accreditors entered the game, which is a huge driver of all assessment work now. And at first they were like, we just want you to have a plan. How are you going to assess student learning? So institutions were like, here you go, here's the plan. 10 years later in the cycle, they're like, great. Did you implement that plan? And institutions were like, I'm sorry, you wanted me to actually do that? Didn't get that memo. Let me do something real quick and implement it and give you some information on it. Then it was, okay, great. But what's the data? Did you use that to do anything? Like, how's that going? And they're like, oh, you wanted what? We didn't capture that. Hold, please. Let's get it together. And now it's like getting more into institution-wide engagement. How are you ensuring these processes are sustainable, down to course levels and up, and across all student affairs units, and thinking about it that way. But that has been that kind of external driver saying, do these things, make this happen, while other processes have been unfolding within institutional spaces. If you're like, that's an interesting topic, I would love a paper that looked at that across the 1980s to today, where would I go? Peter Ewell. Look at Peter Ewell. Peter Ewell wrote a paper where he just cites himself kind of in an angry style partway through. He's like, I told you 20 years ago. You didn't listen to me then. And we're back where we are today. But it's a beautiful piece about the accountability and improvement over time tension that we've had. And how do we get out of it? How do we address it? How do we think about these relationship pieces in order to make it happen? I give you all of that context to help say when you do assessment work, you run into, because of that history and because of things driving and institutions going, you wanted me to do what? What counts as passing? These mythical requirements that are now floating around that faculties and student affairs and others believe they need to do, like, tell me the right way to do assessment. Just give me the answer, and there's only one way to do it. And if I know that, it's great. That I can only use Bloom's taxonomy. No other verbs could possibly be accurate or helpful to what I'm trying to do. That if you don't have the right mix of direct and indirect, like it's going to be wrong for somehow that. That if they're not measurable in a particular way, like you're wrong and you need to do it again. And you have to do this like we're running a standard, a controlled trial for medicine kind of levels of science that we need to address to. These things are not true, but they come from that engagement and that working that out with it. It also means that the things that we ask people to do have histories of themselves as well. Like learning outcome statements haven't always been the things that we think they are with learning outcome statements. They're rooted in behaviorism, which gets to some of these mythical requirements about how something has to be measurable in a particular way. And what that means in relation to our curriculum. So I leave you with this just as like, oh, that's interesting. And also to say that this leads to their shifts in definitions and framing over time. So when someone's like, what is assessment? You need to be like, where and when? Like, in what setting and situation and when are we talking about? And then I can start to answer your question. Because today we're really talking about these statements about the knowledge, skills, and abilities that students have acquired because of something they've done with us, some intentionally designed educational opportunity. And there's been shifts from these are things that faculty do too, and it's at an institution level, and we know it because students completed a course that they've gotten it somehow, that like just by completing a course, you've met the learning. There's a spectrum, it's kind of pendulum swings that go back and forth over time to, well, employers are the ones that tell us if they've done it, or the student is the one, if they know, then we've done it, and sort of what counts as evidence in different ways of who is the viewer and user of these learning outcomes. And these are choices that you can make about your processes and practices, but it's also things you need to understand about where you sit in your work and where your work lives to be able to then make any changes. So the whole reason you got that like rocket whirlwind of history thrown at you is that history, whatever it is, and it's going to be messy and it's going to be varied and it will look different in different units, impacts why we do this work and how this work has been structured, and then what people believe assessment is or is not. So they might be doing something and you're like, that's assessment. I needed to know about that. And they're like, no, that's not. You're talking about this. You meant if I was doing this very particular type of thing, that's what you wanted to know. And so knowing that it can be many things to many people, very important. Knowing that you're going to have to navigate the purposes and the structures, equally important. So as you engage in conversations, consider what's your current history? How did we get here? what was done before, how did it talked about, all of those things you'll need to know to enact any change and really get things to start to move or be different going forward. So that is why you got a rocket written, not so that you can be like, I know the history of assessment, but to understand that the history of assessment is contextualized to where you are and where you're trying to do work. And you need to think about it and understand it. If you want to see this in practice, because you're like, sounds interesting, but where's my theory to practice connection? Like, how does this look like on the ground? I want to point you towards 3 different resources that talk about what it looks like to change assessment processes over time. The first one is a paper about sort of moving from one iteration of doing assessment to a 2.0 version and like what was the change and how did that look. The other 2 are case studies of institutions that were like, here's what they were doing at one point, and then coming back several years later and saying, what are we doing now? What does this look like? What has changed and what does sustainable look like in this space? And how do you think about that change process and assessment in relation to the history that you had before? So if you want to see how that entails, those are some great resources for you to engage in. All right. Now, I talked about history, but I'd also mentioned theory. So I want you to think about this as not only do I need to understand what happened and where we're trying to go so I can put myself in a position to navigate and manage change, but I need to realize that there are differences in organizational structure for how this is set up. So for part of the book, I did research around institutions. Who do assessment people report to? Where are their offices housed? How are institutions going about doing assessment? And there's a variety of ways. There's like we have a cross-campus committee. It is owned by all. There's no office. There's a committee that does it. Some of these are also grouped in different ways where like you can have a person and committees and that sort of thing. Some have dispersed liaisons. We have people in units that hear from an assessment office or a person and like kind of come back and report and deal with that way. There's reporting, compliance officers, coordinators, people that coordinate the reporting, but it's very reporting function, compliance oriented. There are some places that have like, we do it in a day. We get everyone together. We have our rubrics, like, or we have all our students come, we do testing. That's our day. We look at our data and take a look at it. There are some that look at student samples. There's some that pull from assignments embedded in courses or in student lived experiences. There's others that are like, our data systems are integrated from student affairs to this. The point is, there's not one way to do it. So when you're like, how am I supposed to do it? It's like, I don't know what you got. What kind of structures do you have in place and what are you trying to accomplish in that? And where are the reporting lines? All of these reporting lines happen in different ways, depending on structures, depending on history, depending on context. And there's ways to change them if you're in a place and you don't like the reporting structure you have to get it to move, but it depends different. So for example, if you have a program, this is clearly, I'm a graphics design artist, you're welcome. Hope you like this. You're like, I love your use of arrows and rectangles. So there are models where we look at students, we assess them when they come in, they go all the way through a program, we assess them at the end, we take that information and we make changes to the program for the next group of students that come through. And that's the program doing an assessment process. And that's a structure in place because it's about program improvement, whatever that program might be, a program like a course or a degree program, or a program offered in a unit. There's learning improvement that says we can't make any changes because we want to assess something, we want to give an intervention, and then we want to reassess to see if there's actually been an impact on it. That's a particular structure, that's a particular purpose behind what we're trying to do with our assessment. And then there's even ones that are like, okay, I just need to pass accreditation. I want to give them whatever they want. So we have a system that's like, we got some outcomes, I picked assessments, we're going to gather the results and package them and submit reports. And this cycle unfolds. There's no conversation about use. There's not an improvement piece because the point is we need to just have this process done on reporting for accreditation related to purpose, form, function, right? All connects. Gen Ed, another place where there's all kinds of models that happen, that how they unfold, what it looks like, all of that. I'm not going to read all these to you. The point is, again, there's not one way to do it. There are many ways that this is structured and various things impact that. How it's set up organizationally, who has reporting lines, what the purpose is, and the history all lead to the structures and form for what it's going into. We have other models that are like, we're going to constantly, continuously assess them because we need to know our students before they get to the end, where they are in their learning to make changes. Competency-based education is a great example of this. You can't advance without doing it. Peggy's real-time student assessment is a model related to like, that's how to think about assessing. That means we're collecting very different things from a program assessment process that looks at them at one point in time and another point in time and loops it that way. It's going to look very different depending on what you're trying to do. There's also models that look like this, which are related more to trying to understand student success. So integrating academic and student affairs to say, how are we looking at where students are learning and making student success plans to advance them in their learning, because the focus is not on what are we learning as a program, but what are the students learning and how are we getting the students aware of and part of moving them in that direction. So when you think about how you want to do your assessment work, the action plans you want to implement, how you want to move from theory to practice, you need to know that the purpose, why you're trying to drive this, and is it different from your historical context and where does it fit, will lead to like the approaches and the processes that follow from that to be implemented. And so what you're trying to do, form follows function, function follows form. You know the thing I'm trying to say. You got it. I believe in you all. So as you think to yourselves, and I will pause here because there's a lot, and I wanted to save some time for questions. What is the purpose of your assessment process or practice? And how does that purpose inform the implementation, structure, and organization? And if you're like, I don't want to think about that, you can also think about what is your history of assessment, and if you're trying to do something differently, how are you going to need to navigate that history in that place where you're trying to make change? So I will pause there. Actually, I'll even do a stop share. So Joe, you can then share and I can see people if they have questions. So let me do that. Is there any questions, comments? You're blowing my mind.
Taking him to assessment school here with all the history and
It
everything.
was like a fast-tracked history. That is not how you do like a 101 intro course. You're like, do you want to be a history major? We're gonna we're gonna do it like this. Jane, I didn't know you taught swing. And Lindy? Sorry, I'm catching up on chat. I love it. All right. Hey, Enrique. I was gonna say, hearing no questions, I'm happy to pass it to Joe, or if Enrique needed to say anything, or make it out, attempt to do that too. Yes, no, I know it was a rocket.
That's the plug too of we if you want to know more or digest it better, stay tuned for the book. Okay, well, feel free to ask questions. The nice thing about the way we broke it up is Natasha presented her part, and if you all have questions about it, she can answer some of those in the chat, or also we can hold and look to respond to them live as we go along. But I want to move through the second portion here of looking to actually operationalize this information in the present, right? So given all that history and given this context and thinking about our current work and the circumstances we're in, what do we do now, right? So one of the things I talk about often is these are the things assessment should be. It should, and I'll work through these. The one little aside I'll say that's a funny thing that when I told Natasha, she was like, "You gotta like talk about this often." We came up with these concepts when at one of my institutions, and I was trying to think like, is there an acronym? Is there something I can use to pull it together? And actually, the order that it's in, MIMIR, is the first letter of each of those is actually like a Norse god that Odin used to keep around. I won't share too much more about it because it gets a bit gruesome. But what's really cool is Mimir, the Norse god, was kept around for counsel and insights and advice. And so it's so appropriate that kind of stumbled into that with what we talk about for assessment here. But let me go through each of these briefly. But meaningful, right? Assessment should be meaningful. Otherwise, yeah, people aren't going to want to do it. But since we need to do it and should be doing it, let's make sure it matters. Because even if it doesn't matter to you, it matters to accreditors. It matters to other people. So let's make it meaningful. But it should also be impactful. Assessment should lead to change. If the reality for our students is not meeting our expectations, we should be taking action, right? But it should also be manageable. Assessment should not be unrealistic, right? It shouldn't be something that bogs people down and they just feel overwhelmed by it. That's not going to help anybody, right? So let's make sure that the work we're doing is manageable. It should also be informative. If people go through an assessment cycle and feel like their world and life would have been completely the same if they hadn't gone through it, something went wrong. So, assessment should always be answering questions or generating inquiry. And lastly, assessment should be robust. I talk all the time, and this is why I love working in assessment, is it has so many beneficial byproducts and benefits to other parts of the university: planning, resource allocation, budgeting, strategic planning, curriculum development, informing student affairs interventions. Assessment can inform and help all of that stuff. Now you may be thinking, well, gosh, Joe, it sounds amazing, but it can't be that easy to achieve all of those aspects of assessment. And you're right. There's always work to be done, and an assessment at every institution, myself, mine included, isn't perfect. But what we can do is set a firm foundation by moving through the pieces, right? Have good assessment plans. A plan is outlining who you are, like your learning outcomes, what you're measuring, when you're measuring it, how your efforts align to um, the rest of the institution, strategic plan, the alignment of intervention outcomes measures. But this is all important information to document, and it'll be beneficial to have it documented to then play out in other settings or to use as a foundation as we're then going about and doing the work. It's important to understand how everything fits together conceptually, right? This was the model at one institution I had. It's a little complex. It's got a lot of parts to it, especially having some learning outcome levels at different levels of learning for the degree programs, as well as student affairs, divisional learning outcomes. Use kind of a simplified framework, right? Where we're thinking about institutional learning outcomes and alignment to academic program learning outcomes, course learning outcomes. But then there's an equivalent on the student affairs side, right? They also have some divisional priorities and learning expectations, as well as office or intervention specific learning outcomes. And all of this should be aligning to your institutional framework of what's expected for students to learn, think, and do both inside and outside of the classroom. And formatting got a little funky here, but if you're need help with articulating learning outcomes, I have an article about this, and it explains looking through and thinking about learning outcomes from the W perspective: who's expected to learn, what learning is expected, when and where the learning takes place, and why is the learning expected, or from an ABCD perspective: audience, behavior, condition, degree. But in addition to having the learning outcomes, we need to see how they hang together. This is uh, an example. I stripped out the identity, but for eagle eyes, you may recognize some of the initialisms here. This is for an education program, as they have their different accreditation standards for INTASC, IPTS, SPA. But this shows in this one visual the program learning outcomes, alignment to university learning outcomes, connection to accreditation standards, and connection to course learning outcomes. And so then you can see, even just visually, where and how these things show up, the saturation of these components, and that can tell a story as well as help inform your assessment efforts. Here's a student affairs example, a pretty fancy one from St. Paul College. They're a community college in Minnesota. And this is, again, for student affairs, their co-curricular units. Across the top are the different departments or offices. Along the left side are their co-curricular divisional learning outcomes. And so then those are marked with X's along the rows. And then along the bottom are their college or institution-wide learning outcomes that even their academic units align to. And those are shown up with different icons. And so from this visual, you can see the extent with which certain departments are contributing to similar learning outcomes, both from a student affairs division level, but also to academic affairs outcomes. And this becomes a great visual for people to know the pieces and the piece they play in the larger puzzle of student success and student learning. And so this is where this documentation is not just good for you, it's good for others and informative for others. But aside from your learning outcomes, you need to have measures, right? And this is my English major coming through. I made an acrostic several years ago to talk through the steps in how you figure out your methods. So first you start with your purpose, right? Then you review your past efforts. You want to think about what worked well, what didn't go so well. If you didn't have a past effort, then imagine, well, what data do you wish you would have had to build off of? That can help inform your process as well. And then evaluate your methods for appropriateness, account for logistics and resources, right? What limitations do you have? What technology do you need? And one of the most important steps, test the draft of your design. Many times surveys will be sent out or instruments will be designed and people don't realize the way in which the data is going to come back to them. And then they get their data and it's really messy or it doesn't meet what they needed from a reporting perspective. The horror story I have is from one psychology department from an institution I will not name, but they were very confident as psychologists and psychometricians that they knew how to build a rubric, and they were building this rubric for their dissertation students. And I asked if they wanted any help. They said no. Fast forward to the end of the year, and they said, Joe, we need help looking at our data because it looks really weird and we can't make heads or tails of it. Can you help download this or reformat it for us? And somehow they built this rubric that like somehow overrode itself based on like the way they put the questions into this online form. And so they thought they were capturing all this information in real time. Thankfully, they like logged the grade for the student, but this rich outcome specific data in this form all got lost because they didn't test their instrument. Oh, I've gone fuzzy. They didn't test their instrument, and um, so their data was a wash for the year, which was really disappointing. And if they would have just taken like 2 minutes to do some testing of their instrument and then clear the data, it would have alleviated that. So can't stress enough, test your instrument. But also the final step to this whole create across it is go back to the beginning. So you have this thing, you've tested it, you like it, it meets your, it's appropriate, you have the resources for it. Is it meeting your purpose? Right? Before you put it out there, is this still what you're after? Right? And that's where if it's a rubric, a survey, I go line by line and make a comment to the side of how I'm going to use that data. Because if you can't articulate how you're going to use that data, it may not be necessary. Right? And you may have gotten caught up in the whole want versus need side of things with your data collection. But as we pick our measures, then it's important for us to set targets and criteria because there is nothing worse than you do this thing, you get your results, and you go, huh, well, I don't know what this means, right? Like 80%. Is that good? I mean, that's a B. Well, it's good in general, but what if I told you that your data last year was a 90%? Well, now that 80 doesn't look so good, right? So we need to go into these things with our targets and success criteria in advance so that when we get to our resulting data, we know how to interpret it. And if you've never collected the data before, it's fine. Make a hypothesis. I guarantee that if you've never collected the data before, I could give you 3 sets of data. One that would horrify you. You wouldn't want anyone to see that if that was the result. And one that you'd be running around and putting it on your president's desk because you're so thrilled this was the result. And then I could probably give you a data set you go, yeah, that's about what I expected. So you can use that gauge to set your data with these targets if you've never done it before. And then the best part about this is you have your first data informed action that you can take of changing your target once you collect your data. So don't neglect this step. If you need help, I wrote a little blog on how to do that. But the last thing too is really thinking about what are we going to do on the reporting side of things. And this is where and I made this little chart because when I say report, this is what I mean. Your report should tell a story. It should talk about your process. It should talk about the analysis, the interpretation. What does this mean? Right? You don't just flash data and expect people to understand it. You need to interpret it. You need to give it meaning. Data does not have meaning on its own. You need to give it meaning in the context of your report. And that's where you should involve multiple perspectives to make sure it's not just you, connecting dots that really aren't there, right? Have multiple perspectives to help provide a rich interpretation of what this can mean. But then also talk about actions, talk about what you're going to do. the so what, right? So you read through this and okay, this is what you did and what you found. So what? Well, tell them so what. This is what we're going to do. These are the changes we're going to take as a result of this, because assessment should lead to action. And for people who are like, well, we met all our targets, or everything's great, there's nothing concerning, so we have no actions. No, you always have actions. You can always share your results. You can always tell more people, or share it in new ways, or take what's so successful about your process and share it with other people who can't seem to find that same success. Right? There's always things you can do. That's like when I go to campuses and try and play like who can stump Joe with assessment issues. That's the first one I say is like, who says like there's nothing they ever have in terms of actions for the reports, because I guarantee I can find things for you to do. And I haven't been stumped yet with that. So um, make sure that your reporting process doesn't get neglected, right? It doesn't just stop with your data coming in and you writing something and putting it on a shelf or sending an email. It's a process, and it should then lead into your next cycle. So, similar to Natasha's piece, what are you going to do next? Right? I just walked through all these steps, all these things, and I know it could be a lot, a bit like Natasha's piece. Could be a lot, but start somewhere. Think of something, right? Even if it's going back to the meaningful, impactful, manageable, informative, robust. Maybe there's one of those elements you really want to hone in on improving at your institution, right? Maybe that's your next step, or that's your self-reflection and examination to take your efforts to the next level. Or maybe it's realizing, you know what, our assessment plans could be a bit more robust, or could have a bit more content and meat to them to help set us up for success. Or maybe, like the examples I gave, your method selection could use some additional quality assurance pieces to it of testing and ensuring your purpose is being met before they get deployed. But what are those things that you might look to do, right? The next steps you're going to take, um, or what you would want to begin to implement given this information. I'll let you all think about that. We have just a few more slides of resources, so I'll go through those. You all can make some comments, but I'll go through these. Then that's it. We can just open it up for questions. But we're not leaving you empty handed. We've had some resources that we shared throughout, and I see Natasha's been awesome in putting links in the chat. But know that we're not the only ones out there, right? There are whole entire organizations dedicated to assessment, and these organizations do blogs and journals and webinars and conferences and have resources. And some of these are free, some of them are paid. But there's plenty of information out there. And even for the paid ones, they still put out some free resources for everybody. And there's a number of journals and blogs dedicated to assessment or that touch on assessment that you can check out. And also, there's some free structured learning environments on NILOA's website. There was this LARC grant project where the website itself kind of is a course, and you can click through these tabs and click through the content. They'll expand like accordions, and you can move through this information on your own. Also, the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders puts on an open course. It's a MOOC on applying and leading assessment in student affairs. Don't let the name fool you. It's 90% of the content is applicable to academic affairs as well. And I say that being the one that helped create the course and who's taught it for 8 years. Trust me, it's stuff that I recommend to my faculty all the time. It's completely free. And even if the timing of it doesn't work for you, once you sign up for it, you retain access for life. Well, I can't guarantee for life, but I can say people who signed up for the first course in 2017 still have access. So you'll at least have access for several years. Happy to share more about that if you want, but tons of stuff out there. Don't hesitate to reach out or look to get that information. And that's it. So happy for questions, comments. Natasha, do you want to take the Jane's note?
Yeah,
Ask
I was
about
just
my.
putting it in. It's the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, and I'll find a link and throw it in as well. Um, Do it. Oh, you got it. Never mind. An organization that was looking nationally at what are colleges and universities and faculty and staff doing to assess student learning and what works for whom and in what ways. And then taking that and turning it into resources, thought papers, reflective questions, toolkits, that kind of thing. So doing national research to inform local action, I would say would be a way to think about it with case studies and pieces. So it was good. And Joe's course is awesome, as always. I want to pick up on one thing you mentioned, Joe, that I think is such a great part. When we talk about like the meaningfulness, there's always this drive to find meaning in the process of doing assessment. And I think that's where understanding history and that what you're doing with assessment is also telling an institutional story. It's telling a story of why we do the things that we do for the students that we have and the goals that we're trying to achieve. That helps people see how what I'm doing in like my course or my program or my unit or whatever connects to our courses, our programs, our institution, our um, pieces to get into that. But the meaning comes from how does this make sense of, is this part of what we're doing for our values? Is this part of what we're trying to achieve as a group? And so understanding that it's not just how do I get you to do assessment, but why are we all doing assessment in this way? And what is doing it help us understand about ourselves? Can be great. And communication is a culture maker. So that's a good good place to think about and go there on the meaning because it's a lot harder to get people to find a process meaningful if you're just like, but it's like broccoli, it's good for you. They're like, yeah, but still, why? So
And you know, it's something that I think I was talking about this in an earlier session today that assessment people, fortunately, unfortunately, that we have to do it as often as we do, but fortunately, because it's a great opportunity, we really need to set the stage and define for people what assessment should be, right? And that's why I started with that kind of star image because oftentimes people have their own experience or have heard of assessment and it may not be a positive one, right? Or they may be stressed or they may think it's only you know, an accreditation thing, but it's on us to help contextualize it and remind them that no, it's not just for accreditation. Like this is fidelity for again looking at the reality versus our expectations of the work we think we're doing and the impact we think we're having on students. And also the responsibility we have that no institution anywhere is perfectly serving all of their students all of the time. Everyone has to accept that reality. And once you do, then you can realize, yeah, continuous improvement is something we all have to do. And so if we're doing continuous improvement, what can help inform our processes? Assessment's one of those things. It's not the end all be all. There's plenty of other metrics and other information that's out there that you need to look into that you know, adds to the picture, right? So I'm not saying assessment is the only thing we should ever be paying attention to, but it's a pretty important thing given that higher education is about education and about student learning. So it's one of those things that the meaningful aspect, I think, is always a piece we can be working on and changing hearts and minds about the nature of the work. And I think sometimes we need to take that as a responsibility to put ourselves out there and help shape that narrative. And then hopefully along the way, gain some assessment champions so that they can be doing that work for us and talking to their peers.
mhm. I think it's also so important today because then Amy, I see you came up, so I'd love to hear your questions in a second, but I want to finish this, but like that at our students, our contexts are so different. Things are shifting so quickly. We need assessment to help us make decisions on how to best serve and meet our students. Like we need it more so having that ongoing regular process becomes much more important in the event we have to pivot, in the event that something shifts. Like we can make better informed choices to support our students in times of crisis when we have these regular ongoing pieces. And so, yes, I mean, clearly Joe and I are both like, we love assessment, assessment's great, but it as an institution, if we're not just doing it as a rote exercise, it can be so powerful for a variety of things that we need to know and be able to do. But Amy, please, you have a question or comment. Oh no, I think you're muted.
I have a question.
Do you, or did you just come on camera?
I was just coming to
I,
say
I
hi.
haven't.
Hi, I'm gonna be like, do you have you have one? You can't.
I was showing my colleague support by attending. But Enrique has a question.
As Natasha or Joe, um, as faculty, I always say, what can we do on Monday? Monday, where do we start on Monday?
I mean, that's where for me, and it's building off of what Natasha just shared too, is every institution is different. And one of the things I talk about often is ride the wave, ride the institutional momentum, go with the flow. So, there's umpteen things we could be improving, right? We have a longer list of things we could be changing and improving than we have the ability to tackle at any given time. So try and do your own prioritization. And if you can't, because it's too hard, right? Like you can't choose which program is better, or you have
Absolutely.
equal problems or stresses everywhere. Look outside of your focus and look at where the institutional momentum is, right? Like I know, like one example is my institution right now. Um, we just went through this big push as we're onboarding a bunch of new faculty and creating some new roles, that we just rolled out this brand new like faculty playbook in this teaching philosophy. And so there's all this professional development coming out about that. And so for me, while there's so many things I'd like to talk to faculty about in terms of assessment, I'm trying to gear some of my PD and trying to ride that wave and be part of those conversations when we're talking about the faculty role and responsibility, and what you do inside your course and what you have a responsibility for. I'm plugging assessment, right? I'm talking about the value of student learning and how that's pertinent to their job. And it's not just a report. It's not just something the department chair is responsible for, but that you have a role in that, right? And that when those conversations do happen, you have a voice, and you should have a voice. And if not being invited to the meetings or the process to reports, you should look to invite yourself or ask questions, or talk to me and I'll help get you plugged in. But that's just one example of, I think that's a way too, that if you're not sure where to start, look where the energy is and see how you can tap into that, because then people are wanting to, they're already working in that direction and moving in that direction. So glob onto that and make it a win-win. Help them achieve their goal, but also advance some of your assessment practices.
I want to answer the two questions together that are in the chat. So there's a question about, in current climate of budget constraints and use of success metrics for performance-based funding, how do we keep the focus on learning improvement and assessment, along with like how often should we be assessing, and when should, how often should we be willing to change our objectives these days? So one of the things, I was working with an institution in the Northwest, and they were coming under a new performance-based funding model. And as part of that, they changed their assessing cycle to line up with the funding, like budget review cycle, so that you could say, as I'm doing my learning, here's how I'm putting things into funding to go towards improvement. And our target goal to be able to meet some of these success metrics are doing these improvement things over time. Where they ran into an issue was in faculty conversations on like, well, if more students are doing well and passing certain courses, right, then are we getting into like grade inflation, and are we doing these other parts? And part of improvement is, if we're getting better, right? Shouldn't more students be successful? Like if we got better at what we're doing and we found out better information to help us determine what we need to be doing, what's most impactful, the things that are really working, how we need to structure certain educational experiences to really get it for students and like different specific student populations, we would expect more students to be succeeding. That's kind of the goal. And so if part of our learning improvement is that these are things that we want all our students to get and some aren't getting it, and if they get it, that also helps them be more successful because they're able to advance. We can put these things together to help us determine where do we need to focus, how do we want to think about it, and where do budgets want to align. It's difficult when you're like, I'm on like a 7-year improvement plan. We got a long road. There's a lot of runway here, and I need to be working to think about how to move. That's where I think you can get into some interesting partnership opportunities. And you need to start thinking about how do we integrate and work with different units, different programs, like engage in that. That's a separate conversation. But there are some, I think, good ways to keep this on. We are really all about trying to improve. And if our business is learning, like we want students to leave because with learning, they've learned something, they're better for it, they have knowledge and dispositions that they didn't have, or they've refined them and refocused and all those things, then we would want to see that improvement. It should come in. How often you should assess? That's a context history kind of thing. This is one of those when you're like, I'm trying to do it every year. Could you do it every 3 years or every 5 years? What are you doing in year? What makes sense? What are your cycles? So the institution slowed their cycle in this case because they wanted to line up with the budget. So they'd been doing an annual report that was asking these questions about like, what do you assess? And then people would get the data, and like 2 weeks after they had the data, they had to fill out this report that also included, and what did you do with the data? And they're like, I'm still making sense of it. I don't even know what it means. And I got my final grades coming in at the same time. Like, I don't know what's going to happen with that. Like, we'll see how this plays out. So they actually extended out their cycle to say, figure out what you're assessing, get people together, figure out where this is happening in your courses, what you're trying to do as a program, come up with your actual plan. Don't just give us some outcomes because you gave us some outcomes and you haven't reviewed them in like 20 years and no, they're not even anything to do with your curriculum. Get together and figure out what questions do you have about your students, their success in your programs. Come up with what you're going to focus on, narrow it in. Tell us how you're going to do it. Go ahead then the next year, get that going and do it. And then take a year to figure out what does that mean? What's the data? How are you going? Do you need to go talk with people? Do you need to interface with IR? Like, what are all the things you need to do? So it became a 3-year cycle of thinking about, well, and then now what questions do we have based on that data and how it worked? At other institutions, a 3-year cycle would not work at all. Like it just would not fly. It would not operationalize what they're trying to engage in. It wouldn't serve the needs of the students that they have or the cycle of turn at which they need information and data. So what are you trying to do in your assessment process? What types of questions and things are you going to need to answer? And then what's the pacing and the rate at which you need to use that information? And then depending too on what type of data you're going to need to answer that, what's the cycle by which you can get it reliably, accurately, and then have time to take a look at it and make plans. So I would say it's contextualized and dependent on a variety of factors. But part of that should be when are we going to review and make sure that our outcomes are relevant at different points of time as well.
I would just add too, like one of the things I say all the time is, aside from perhaps programmatic accreditors who may have very specific things for their discipline or for certain programs, I've not encountered much literature, research, or requirements for institutions writ large that have a hard specificity around like you must do an annual report or your program review cycle needs to be every 3 years. You know, a lot of research actually and literature actually says like, again, keep it manageable. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how much you do or how often you do it if nothing's happening from it. So, that's where there's a lot of conversation around, well, if you have, I don't know, 6 learning outcomes, maybe measure 2 per year. That's a 3-year cycle. Or maybe measure 3 one year, 3 the next. That's a 2-year cycle. Or maybe you start with 2 to start easy, and then over time you add some more each cycle. So again, to Natasha's point, it's context specific. It's also what works, what doesn't work. You should not measure everything all of the time. You shouldn't do that. I can say that for sure. So in light of that, that's where also too, if you look at your plan and you're measuring something and you measured it, and things were okay, or change is needed, so then put it on pause. Take it off the plan for next year and work on changes, measure something else, and then come back to it. So yeah, it really depends on context, your capacity, and again, what's also going on with the institution and where there's some energy and momentum that might align with the things you're working on. But I think too, when you're really in the groove, your needs, your questions, your curiosities will also help guide your capacity in the work. And when everything's working right and you're firing on all pistons, like, then you got the support across the institution, you have collaborators across the institution, and it'll just naturally fall into a rhythm and something that's manageable and informative and leading to change. And that's when you got something good going.
Thank you, Joe. Please join me in thanking Joe for being so awesome, doing food competitions and choreographed dancing. Thank you all for staying. I apologize for running you over. And thank you for your great questions, commentary, and enjoy the rest of your day.